Hi everyone, and welcome back to our second week on melody. So today, just like we did with percussion, we're going to be looking at how to use MIDI programming and software instruments to create melody. And because we have looked at this before with percussion, a lot of it will be familiar ground. So hopefully everybody still remembers how to program new MIDI data into different software instruments, meaning that what we'll mostly cover here is some additional considerations for when we're writing melody. But again, just as a quick refresher, if I take this top track just up here and solo it so we can't hear the others, I can either input MIDI data by pressing Command K to get at my musical typing keyboard, and then simply perform some data while recording, like so. And then once we've recorded that, if I just close this keyboard for a moment, we can either double click this cell here to open up the editor, or we can simply press E on the keyboard to toggle that on and off. So then in this editor, of course, we can change the pitch of different notes, or change their duration, and then also the velocity, which is their loudness or intensity. But then instead of recording, we can also, in this editor interface, hold Command to get a pencil tool, and then we can draw in our own notes. Yeah, with that covered, I'll just delete that clip, unsolo this track, and then we'll start to talk about some of the additional considerations that come into play when we're writing a melody using MIDI. So I've got just a simple project here to start us off. It's got 3 layers of accompaniment on top of which we're going to write a melody, and they're all MIDI. So we've got a drum track here with MIDI data programmed in, as you can see down the bottom, and hopefully this looks familiar to your work on rhythm. Then we've also got a bass line, again programmed with MIDI data, as well as a synth layer for chordal accompaniment, which we can tell down here in the editor because multiple notes are stacked on top of each other at the same time. So I'll have a quick listen to this example just to understand the context in which we'll be trying to write the melody. Yeah, so as a quick note, each of these instruments are just available standard in GarageBand, which we can just access from the library up here in the top left or by pressing Y on the keyboard. I haven't added any additional effects to them, and I haven't really balanced them either. But yeah, now that we've got our accompaniment layers, we can start to consider writing a melody. And of course there's a multitude of different ways to go about this. So for one, if you have any experience with music theory, you can go straight ahead into your melody track and begin to program in a melody manually, knowing already which notes will be compatible. But of course, even if you don't have any experience and you'd prefer to use this editor to manually write notes, don't forget that it has playback functionality. So if we try to program a note in, you'll still get to hear it. And then you can move it around to try to find the note that you might be looking for. But if we put that aside for the moment, generally the most effective way for a beginner will be to take the performative approach, so where you try different notes in real time using this keyboard here. And again, what this will allow you to do is just use your ear to audition the notes without actually knowing any musical theory, and hopefully you can tell straight away if the note's sounding dissonant or clashing, as opposed to the types of notes that you have in mind. And at this stage we bring in the first of many considerations for when we go to write a melody as opposed to, say, a drum beat. And that first consideration is register. So register, in other words, is how high or low the melody is generally. So if the whole melody is up in a really high octave or down in a really low octave, or if it goes between the two. But what that means for us practically is that we'll first want to audition different octaves to see how high or low in the realm of pitch we want this melody to sit. So as we can see at the moment, we're sitting in the octave C3, and we'll try some different notes to see if they sound too high or low for what we're going for. So maybe you want to go higher, or again lower. And of course that's totally your call based on your creative intentions. But yes, once we've chosen an octave, let's say this high one, we can then come back and start to play our accompaniment so that we can try different melody pitches over the top to see what works and what doesn't. So those notes are working pretty well over the top, but of course I do already know music theory, and I'm aware of what notes will likely be appropriate. But of course keep an eye out for notes that aren't, so if I were to play now what would be considered an incorrect note, you'll hopefully be able to identify that pretty quickly, and then through a sort of a process of elimination, you'll start to hone in on which notes are correct. But to help out with that some more, what we're going to look at next week, among some other things, is a few different sort of beginner guides to music theory to let you discover which notes are correct for the key you're using without having to go into too much detail of the complexities of harmony in general. Yeah, now that we've chosen an octave or a register and we've started to fiddle with different notes to see what's working, we have a few more considerations before we actually settle on any particular melody line. So one big consideration, which is also common to percussion, is the instrument itself, meaning that maybe we've found the right notes and in the right octave, but we're not happy with the tone of the instrument. And again, the quickest way to change that for MIDI is to open up this library and then select one of these other software instruments. So here's our original instrument. And if you don't like that but you still want a synth kind of a sound, we can try one of the others. But then if you're looking for something entirely different, we can zoom back out and select other categories of instruments. So maybe a guitar, or a piano, or anything else here. And there are quite a few instruments that do come standard with GarageBand, so it's worth exploring this library here to find the exact kind of sound that you want. So yes, now we have an instrument we're happy with, we've chosen some notes that we're happy with, and we have them in the right octave, but then there's still three more fundamental things that we want to consider about the melody as we try to write it and sculpt it into something that we're happy with. And those are the pacing of the melody, so how quickly the notes are occurring, the shape of the melody, so if it's ascending or descending or a mixture of the two, and then the use of dynamics in the melody, so are some notes louder or softer, or is it all consistent and for what different reasons. So to let us discuss that in a little more detail, what I'm going to do now is just record in an example melody, and then we'll start to talk about those three features. And just so you know, I'll be recording this with an actual plugged in MIDI keyboard, so you won't see anything on the screen, but I'll be playing an actual keyboard off screen just to make it a little easier to record. Yeah, so that'll do for now just as an example. And before we even open up the editor to look in more detail, we can already analyze a lot of the features like the shape and the pacing of the melody just by looking at the data graphed here. So we can see, for example, that it's a mixture of held notes, like this one here, and then shorter notes, so that we have a balance between the two. And we can also see that there's a bit of a balance in the pacing itself. So these notes here, these ascending few notes are happening quite quickly, and then these next three longer notes are spaced out quite a lot. The other thing we can see straight away is the contour of the melody, or in other words, the shape of its pitch over time. So we can see that through the beginning, it's reasonably static. So we have a fairly even distribution of ascending and descending phrases for this first part, looking a bit like a zigzag on the data. Then in the latter half, we can see that it's mostly descending. And then another thing we discuss or analyze when we're considering contour is whether the notes not only ascend or descend, but move in steps or leaps. And so to demonstrate now, I'll just open up the editor, then drag it up a bit just so we can see a bit more. And yeah, we'll see that in moments like this, the melody is moving up in steps, so generally just to the next one or two or three notes. And then at other times, to create a bit of contrast and balance, the notes will actually move in big leaps. So from this note all the way down, and then all the way up. And the reason I keep saying balance is because generally that's a nice way to approach a melody if you're sort of struggling to think of ideas. So then we generally have things like a descending phrase here, balanced by an ascending phrase, and then this stepwise motion, balanced by a leaping motion. And again, like we saw up top, we can see that on the larger scale. So at first we have a zigzagging kind of static balance between ascending and descending phrases, and then we conclude with a large descending phrase from our highest pitch down to our lowest pitch. And planning out some little features like that not only help you to write your melody, but all of these things that we've discussed so far are great to analyze in your written documentation, particularly if you can relate them to their musical function. So perhaps the reason you've had this large descending phrase at the conclusion of your melody is to finish off the song so that it's a gradual letdown from its highest note, or the climax of the melody's contour, down to its final note, to give a sense of closure and finality. But we will discuss these concepts in a little more detail over the next few weeks. So yeah, now if I zoom in a little more, another thing to consider, just like we did with percussion, is dynamic variation, meaning that you might want to emphasize some contour in the melody, like this ascending phrase here, by having it gradually get louder until its highest note. But yeah, just be aware we don't actually have to have every single note of a melody the same volume either. Yeah, with all of that covered, it's now up to you to go and experiment with different MIDI programmed melodies, particularly if you didn't use MIDI last time for a rhythm assessment, because when it comes to melody, it's generally a lot more time consuming to have to cut up different audio samples as well as sourcing good audio samples themselves to construct a melody when we could be programming a MIDI melody by hand with complete control over all of these different aspects. So I'd highly recommend giving melody through MIDI programming a try. And on that note, for anyone who'd like to try it specifically with this accompaniment here, I'm going to upload this project to Blackboard so that you can download it, try your own different melodies to get a bit of practice and see what works. Of course, feel free to change any of these instruments here as well to try different styles, change the tempo or anything else you'd like to experiment with, as long as you're getting in there and practicing, because melody comes from experience. So that basically covers this week's material. In summary, when we're writing a MIDI melody, we want to consider what instrument we're using. We want to find the right octave, so how high or low the melody is in general. We want to consider its pacing, so how quickly the notes happen, and then maybe a balance between infrequent and frequent notes. We want to consider the shape or the contour over time, so is it ascending, descending, and does it move in steps or in big leaps? And then finally we might consider the dynamic of each different note, so loud and soft notes, etc. And of course, with all of these concepts, consider a balance and a contrast between them. So maybe balance ascending phrases with descending phrases. And it'll help you both to structure a melody, as well as give you things to analyze in your written document. So as always, if you have any questions, please ask in the forums or the online chats and I'll try to help. And I hope you'll enjoy creating melodies. Thanks.